Welcome to episode 19 of It's About Data, the podcast about data, analytics, AI, and whatever we feel like talking about. Your hosts are Tony Baer of DB Insights and Matt Housley of Half Pipe Systems. This episode, Jessica Talisman joins us to explain why knowledge infrastructure is a vital ingredient of artificial intelligence. So, Jessica, welcome. I first met you, I think, on the Monday morning data chat with Joe. And actually, back then, we were talking about library sciences. And I think you and Ol Banyu have been talking a lot about the connection between data, AI, and library sciences. And so I'd love to hear about, I know you have kind of a new recent blog venture, and you're talking a lot about knowledge graphs. So let's hear about both of those things.
Sure. I think we met in 2022. So it's
That
been
sounds
a while.
about right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I started recently a new newsletter on LinkedIn called The Knowledge Engineer, which I also have in my Substack. And I'm talking about mostly knowledge graphs and how we structure information and knowledge, particularly the need for knowledge infrastructures. So we talk so much about data infrastructures, but we really haven't tackled the hard issues. You know, AI is a knowledge tool.
Yeah.
It's a socio-technical tool, much like the internet, but we're still living in the era and days of data and data-only architectures. And the reality is we're tripping over ourselves in trying to manifest knowledge out of data, which is the atomic unit or the molecular element that ultimately forms knowledge. There have been very heated debates lately about the DIKW, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid or hierarchy.
Yeah.
Recently, in the past few days, on in chats, and it's not to dogmatically adhere to that sort of pyramid or structure, but we do have to think of AI as a knowledge tool to that point, and also think of how humans acquire knowledge.
Let me ask something, and I mean, this really does strike home. And actually,
Yeah.
when we were at Day to Day Tech, actually, were you at Day to Day Texas this year?
Yes,
And
I was.
for me,
Yes.
the takeaway from it was that what we really do lack is context.
Yep.
It's kind of like we're buried with all this data. It's kind of like like the bad old days of big data. But the other thing that kind of scares me on all this is I remember back in the 1990s, we had this consultant called knowledge management. How do we end up, avoiding getting into this sort of fruitless sort of like, search for something like that's really abstract, like knowledge management? How do we avoid these boondoggles, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think unfortunately things like knowledge management have gotten a very bad rap because of those
Okay.
experiences and the silos around them. It's really about incorporating, diversifying our assets and our ways of thinking, creating networked architectures that support not just data, but take it to the next step of information and then the next step of manifesting knowledge. So it is a form of knowledge management. I hate to say it. It's something we can't really move away from, but I think there's opportunity to reinvent what knowledge management means. I mean, context engineering is the other big buzzword that's emerging within the market. Similar to knowledge engineering, it could encompass anything really. But the idea is lending context and meaning to data. And what do we mean when we say adding context and meaning to data? It means that we have to be able to represent that data as information or mature it to have the structure of information, which some might argue is having, being able to declare types, being able to declare attributes, being able to name entities, semantic layers. That is sort of the beginning, but it's not one thing and one thing only. We have to create dynamic, multifaceted architectures that support not only the business, but AI workflows.
And so tell me, so it sounds like knowledge graphs are a big part of this. And so explain, say, to a person from a data background, what a knowledge graph is, like explicitly. Yeah.
So a knowledge graph declares classes. It uses ontologies. Ontologies have become very loaded in that some people relate ontologies simply to schemas. But in fact, ontologies define classes, which you can think of as nouns like people, places, things. We have properties and attributes, which are descriptors, relationships, which can have different types of relationships. And then you have logical reasoning that's built into an
Mm,
ontology. So an ontology allows for direct and indirect relationships, certain rule bases, because we're not confined to rows and columns or
yeah.
tables. We're not confined in knowledge graphs to these like rigid rule bases that exist in relational database systems. It's breaking out of that construct, and it's a more dynamic data model. So we can really
Interesting.
think about it in those terms. And so, and again, it's not either or.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll tell you,
Hmm.
this is something I compare this to. Tell me if this seems like a fair comparison.
Yes.
But to me, programming language parsers have a lot of overlap with knowledge graphs. Like you're breaking
Yes.
down the structure of the programming language and finding out, okay, does this code you've written make sense? And one of the places I'm seeing degradation of functionality in this era of generative AI is that things that these parsers were really good at, like just detecting syntax errors
Mm-hmm.
and detecting consistency of variable names, suddenly we've gotten very, very bad at with these tools like Copilot. And that's where I'm
Yes.
like, okay, wait a minute. We want to embrace the new technology. Like you're saying, it's not, but it shouldn't be either or. And so if we're dismissing the old technology in order to do this new thing, that's a problem. Because so I'm calling out a vendor here. Sorry, Databricks, but like I recently did a customer eval of Databricks for a client, and it's a great platform, but their AI assistant is absolutely atrocious. Like it generates bad code that doesn't work. And a lot of this would be solvable from my perspective just with basic parsers. And I kind of think
Right.
from your perspective, it's not dissimilar, right? It's like
Right.
these basic aspects of knowledge that even Google search used to be good at. Google search has gotten a lot worse at certain things because this
Yes.
code that was running inside Google Brain doesn't seem to be running anymore.
No. And being able to, in some cases, it can take more work
Yeah,
to figure out, like if using Copilot or somebody, like even if you
right,
ask AI to generate you an ontology,
right.
it's not necessarily going to logically check out or validate as a reliable structure. And
Right.
that's happening all over the place. In that there was an interesting article that was recently posted in terms of the secondary market and consultants
Yeah.
that we need to have an investigation fee
Right.
because they're so problem ridden. It's like finding a needle in a haystack.
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
yeah, and it ends up being more work than any of us anticipated in those realms.
Yeah. And we're seeing this all over the place in all kinds of professional domains. So, for
Yep,
example, again and again and again, you see attorneys submitting briefs with fake citations, which is a huge no no and can get you
yep,
disciplined by the judge, basically, and potentially disciplined by the bar. And yet, people are using these tools to automate things and not checking their work because checking their work is really, really hard.
it's
And
really hard, and it takes critical thinking
it
skills. That's the
does.
other
Yeah.
part, is like we have to employ critical thinking skills. And somewhere around the 2010s, when it within schools and learning environments,
Yeah.
all of a sudden Wikipedia became a reliable source
Right.
for citations, for example. We started lowering the bar in
Yeah.
general for
Yeah.
citations, for checking your work, for showing your work.
Yeah.
Do those requirements still matter, or do we blindly trust AI to handle that body of work for us? And then do we accept the liability that it comes with?
Right, right. And I'll tell you what
Right?
it reminds me with. This is a rather macabre comparison, but
Yes.
again and again, you see these Tesla self-driving accidents where the driver, before they got injured or killed, again and
Hmm.
again said, "Oh yeah, it has problems with X, Y, and Z," but they continued to use self-driving even though they knew there were certain places where it did not work well. And this feels the same way. It's like, oh yeah, I know, I've seen evidence of this, that this can generate a brief that is incorrect that might cause me to
Yes.
be disciplined, and yet I just keep using the tool blindly without checking my work. And it's like a certain level of complacency, of recklessness that
Yep.
we've embraced right now.
And you can observe it in certain
Yeah,
policies, like Waymo is not
yeah,
going to operate if there's a protest.
right, right,
They know what the liability is there. So it clearly
right.
shows us that if they recognize certain large scale liabilities,
Yeah,
then
yeah,
they're cognizant of those shortcomings.
yeah,
against what they're promoting in the market. So that's the difference, is like the marketing, the divide between reality and marketing. I think
Yeah.
that's what a lot of us are feeling. And
Right.
it's like the parity between those two ends can be ginormous.
It's absolutely
Ginormous.
huge. Yeah. And yet it's right there in your face. So for example, how is it credible that ChatGPT is passing the bar exam if it can't do basic legal work consistently? It's like, okay, maybe under very controlled conditions, it can answer these questions that frankly it's probably seen the answers to somewhere in a data set on the internet. But
Right.
you can't trust it to do basic intern level work at a law firm without massive oversight that is probably more oversight than a human would require. So why are we entrusting it with these things that it's not qualified for?
I was thinking about this
Yeah.
in terms of with Gen AI
Yeah.
and all of our jobs. It's like the difference between street smart and book smart.
Right. Right.
We've always had that comparison. Someone can be book smart, pass the exam, test really well, but
Right.
applied knowledge is very different than abstract or cerebral knowledge. Those are
Yeah.
two separate things.
Yeah.
Back to Google search. It's like,
Right.
yeah, Google search has gotten worse.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
Because often I have to add my own context windows around my
Yeah.
searches I am having to use almost context windows to get the accurate or more accurate responses
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
search.
Yeah. And let me give you a concrete example, and you have some to throw out too, I would guess. So recently I wanted to double check my time zone math. It's a thing, I've on many occasions made a time zone mistake and then the meeting is not at the right time. Okay. So I enter, what is the current time in GMT? And then it gave me the answer, but it wasn't the answer I was expecting. Okay, I'll go double check it. And it had given me the wrong answer. And that's because it had used RAG. It told me what it did. It used RAG to look up the time zone in Wikipedia, but it didn't take into account US daylight savings time. And in the old days of Google Brain, what it did is the deep learning engine would say, oh, it looks like they're asking about the time zone. Therefore, I'm going to go over to logic, which is symbolic, much more similar to knowledge graphs.
Yes,
and I'm going to
yes.
run this code that gives the answer and returns it. And then it would almost always give you the correct answer, right? And so that's where we've seen the degradation. Like we've abandoned the tools that work well for this new and exciting tool that is inconsistent.
Yes. And I'm curious about the weighting as well.
Yeah.
Like, how is it weighted? How are those decisions weighted in generating the query response?
And it just feels like we're taking something that is way pre-production and just like pushing it out into the world without a lot of oversight. Or even having like, what would have made sense to me from a product perspective is to say, have two answers. And like, here's the old Google Brain answer. And then here's the new answer. Beta, use with caution, but here it is. And that's not quite what we're doing right now.
No, and I've had so many false, the most concerning thing is that users, Googlers, that will look up answers with, using Google or using Gen AI. And then we post that as our proof for our own research without vetting the answers. So it becomes this terminal, I told you so, or I did this research. What are you saying? And it leads to contention in the workplace, because then someone ultimately is going to have to vet that answer.
That's right.
Someone ultimately, right? I mean, there's liability attached to, especially when stakes are high, and especially when you're dealing with customer data or internal HR. There's a certain, like any sort of workflow oriented thing. What I'm seeing at a very large scale is like difficulty in workflows with context switching.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So switching context, the thing about ChatGPT is you can just open up a new project, or you can create like a new sort of query set.
Right.
It's different. You can't, it's very difficult to maintain and switch context, maintain a consistent, right?
Yeah.
That's one of the biggest, and so hence context engineering, which leads us to like, what's the minimally viable context and what's the maximum?
Right. Exactly. Because, and some of these things we treated initially as fairly straightforward technical problems, right? So you have this idea of the context window, which is how much text can the chat be aware of in its memory. And so like recently Gemini moved up to like 1 million tokens, which is massive. It used to be kind of 100 pages maybe. But then what we've discovered along the way, which maybe we're not talking about enough, is that even though in theory it has that 1 million tokens in its memory, it actually kind of forgets the stuff. It only really remembers the recent stuff very well, which means that if you had a conversation, say 2 weeks ago, about, say, an HR or paycheck or banking issue, and then you're asking about it again now, it may be far enough back in the context window that it doesn't really remember and it gets confused, even though it appears to know what's going on, and you get
But it
mistakes and you
will
get bad responses.
it will remember your name.
Right.
And it will remember like those little details that
Yeah.
are related to your personal information. And it's fascinating because like within that context window, the memory problem, that's something that graphs do really well. They are very good to act as like a reference data set, so to speak, or
Yeah.
to help to trigger the memory. Now, Google notoriously has always had knowledge graphs and have always employed ontologies. However, when we start getting into the land of vectors or vectorization
Yeah.
without using ontologies, that's where it can get very dangerous and overgeneralized.
Because vectorization, if I understand correctly, you're kind of working in the latent spaces of the model itself, which is as the model is getting trained, it develops these higher order concepts and it says, okay, this concept is closer to this concept over here. But what you're saying is that often that mapping, which happens within that vector space for this model, doesn't actually correspond to what human knowledge looks like.
Exactly. And it's very hard to flatten human knowledge and to distill it. There's tacit, there's explicit, there's different types of knowledge. How do you capture it all? It's nearly impossible, but you can characterize it.
Yeah.
And that's more to speak to the state of our current systems. Like you would have to have a very sophisticated dynamic system in order to be able to handle it. Like you look at something like Wikipedia or Wikidata or DBpedia, like that's probably the closest that we have to human knowledge.
Yeah. And even then, if you're careful, if you're like a writer working on, say, a book or a newsletter, you want to go check those references and make sure that you understand the distillation of that information that's presented to you. And again, that's not really happening right now. And it seems like we're not yet doing the obvious stuff, right? So the obvious next step for like a Copilot or for Databricks would be to say, okay, I have this code generator, but I also have the traditional parser that just checks syntax and makes sure that the syntax actually makes sense and checks keywords to look for deprecated methods. For example, it says, hey, this is deprecated. You really shouldn't use it. It will work technically, but find the documentation over here.
Right. Yeah. And the context also relates to like when you're referencing something like architecture, you're referencing something like type. Is having that really well defined. And that's where ontologies or schemas do very well, because having, for example, a hierarchy creates a decision tree.
Right.
It adds context by parent-child relations. That's like your lowest barrier to entry.
Yeah.
Right. And then having definitions associated with those things. So you define the constraints, just simple definitions. Like you don't have to go super sophisticated and super crazy with your structure, but you do have a responsibility to disambiguate.
And to check your work, right? When the stakes are high, which often even when you're talking to customer service, the stakes are pretty high and a human knows they're on the line, their neck is on the line to get things right. And a chatbot doesn't really have those same stakes to verify information.
It used to be that you could say agent when you wanted to speak to a human, but now that's changed. So it's being able when you have a ticketing system and tickets aren't routed correctly, like the stakes can be very, very high.
Yeah.
And being able to automate that, you have to align the internal world with the external world. And that's one of the most important things that graphs can support is aligning with external definitions of things, because your users, believe it or not, like your customers are coming from the outside world. Their language may not be as nuanced and specific to your brand as you'd like.
Yes.
But that's reality. And so you also have to be able to mitigate those differences and have some sort of entity resolution system to handle that.
Yeah. Which could be a human, right? It's like, oh, I recognize that I am out of my depth here as ChatGPT. And so I need to hand off to an expert. And so in spite of all the denials about the realities of expertise, I think expertise is still really central. And one of the interesting data points to me is that a lot of the AI hype people are like, oh, we don't need software developers anymore. But simultaneously, there's a bidding war for engineers specifically in the Gen AI space where people are supposedly getting multi-million-dollar bonuses. And I'm like, okay, something here, you're saying it's good enough to do everything except for this particular type of engineering that you happen to do. That doesn't quite
Yeah.
scan. It doesn't quite make
And
sense.
then you have people that are able to use AI in
Yeah.
order to create fake-ish profiles and work
Yeah.
at multiple companies. Like,
Yes.
and so the deception, the level of deception in terms of the reality,
Yeah.
and how we have normally iteratively built. I mean, that's the whole reason for agile is it's
Right.
iterative and we work our way up to goals.
Right.
But here it's just like all out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Anything goes, like make it work.
Yeah. Well, and again, with this like Databricks product, I mean, one of the basic things in product management is like, yes, we do agile, but we release things when they're still in process, but you have to,
Yes.
you ensure quality standards, right?
Yes.
And you don't release something and leave it out there in the world when it's like completely broken. And
Yeah.
that's the thing. Like the data part of the Databricks platform would never do that. Like it's a very high quality platform, but then this AI assistant is like way below their quality standards. And that's kind of disturbing.
Right. And it makes
So-
you lose faith. And
Faith
that's
in
the
the
other
product,
part of
yeah,
it
yeah.
is like something I see people not thinking through
Yeah.
is okay, essentially when you employ like ChatGPT within your product
Yeah.
and
yeah.
you're using it as a feature or a function,
Yeah.
like there's an agreement with the customer.
Yeah.
But the secondary agreement is the company has an agreement, like Databricks has an agreement with
Right.
ChatGPT, right?
Right.
And so are you ensuring that people's private and personal information is safe? Sure. But then how do you ensure that for your customers? Because ultimately you become the vendor of that AI assistant.
Right. Right.
So I'm seeing like instances where customers and businesses are demanding their chat history, for example, the
Yeah.
ability to delete their own data
Yeah.
from these AI models. Well, whose responsibility is that ultimately,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
And the problem too is that this data has become much more leaky because in the old days, this would go into some text data set somewhere. And the data science was look at it, and then eventually GDPR came along, and so we developed capabilities to delete chat histories, like you said, right, to comply
Yeah.
with the law. Well, now that data is getting fed back into model training, and it's like, well, once it's in the
Yes.
model, you can no longer delete it. It's just in the model. Like it sort of gets trained over, its intensity sort of declines over years and years as you keep retraining, but it's just in there, and there's no
It's in
there's
there.
no delete button, right?
No, and what's really shocking is you
Yeah.
can find actually it's pretty common stories of people's personal data surfacing
Right.
in queries. So if you have multiple customers with the
Yeah.
CRM customer,
Yeah.
then all of a sudden your customer A, you have a training on all of your data. Customer
Right.
B gets responses and it contains personal data from
Yeah.
customer A. Customer
Yeah.
A's data will inform customer B. How do you draw those clean boundaries?
Yeah.
I've seen architectures where people create sandboxes all over
Yeah.
the place,
Yeah.
supposedly like cordoning off and creating unique instances.
Right.
But
Right.
can that really be unique?
Right. And so far, it doesn't. There's on the one hand, there are technical challenges, and on the other hand, there's a degree of recklessness going on where it's just
Yes.
like, no, don't worry about it. Move fast, break things. That worked for the previous generation. We're going to do it for this technology too. And it's like, hold on, what are the consequences when we break
Yeah,
things
the
now?
consequences.
Yeah.
And also like it's interesting from a roles position
Yeah.
and how a lot of very talented, useful, important thinkers in the
Yeah.
world are getting sidelined or pushed out of organizations. I also see a lot of our brain trust, like the subject
Yeah.
matter experts being pushed out, the ones who can actually model context. There's
Yeah.
been many a layoff in the past year of people that are information architects, context engineers.
Yeah.
It's the casualties have been immense. So I've been
Right.
scratching
Right.
my head like, then who's building these? Who's building the context? Who
Right.
are the context engineers, if not the information architects, if not the knowledge graph engineers? It's sort of we're at a weird crux and sort of the future of who's going to, if we don't have junior engineers, if we don't have people entering the workforce that are able to help to guide these
Yeah.
models,
Yeah.
we're going to be seeing, I've been saying for a while that giants will fall.
Yeah, exactly. I have
Yeah.
this, I like to call it the Dunning-Kruger vice. You familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, where
Yes.
you're so incompetent that you don't know that you're incompetent. And the
Yes.
Dunning-Kruger vice is that people with no tech skills whatsoever are going on YouTube, they're vibe coding and saying, oh, it's so easy, look at this. And then you also have the management class, the CEOs, the CTOs, the CFOs saying, oh, look, I can just vibe code all this. And the software engineers, the experts who actually know how to deal with security and systems architecture and such, are getting squeezed in the middle and told, oh, we don't need you anymore, and laid off, and we're not replacing those people. And in the future, when we need to clean up the mess, like, who's going to do that job? It's not clear.
Right. No, and that's where I think we're going to be seeing a lot more coming from consultants.
Yeah.
At first, I thought that consultants, but there's been several articles about sort of the cost of bringing in consultants, because then those consultants it becomes more expensive because of the mess that's been created at a very large scale, like having to hunt through lines of code to find the needles in the haystack to figure out what went wrong, and is this code sound to begin with, and how can we trust this, and that's where knowledge graphs lend and lending context also lends. It acts like a trust certificate. Right. I mean, like, knowledge graphs can help to point to facts. That's the whole idea of knowledge graphs and ontologies, is we're declaring facts.
And it's not like a perfect replacement for your human experts within your company, but it augments them, where you can say, okay, there's an expert, they're busy, I can at least ask the knowledge graph about this particular piece of code, and then I can go to the expert and ask my question that's a follow-on to that. And that, for now, that doesn't seem to be happening. So
to build a knowledge-rich infrastructure, it takes like a collaboration and multiple stakeholders and multiple experts. And it's not one and done. That's the other thing. We think, oh, we'll get the job done. We've built the taxonomy, we've built the ontology. Okay, see you later. But the thing is that by the time you've launched that knowledge graph, you probably also launched like 10 more features, 2 more products or subproducts. The landscape's constantly changing at this rate and speed that you're constantly having to expand context, create further constraints. It's like a dance. I mean, you're constantly dancing with these models to make sure that you keep things within a boundary and within constraints, so that you can get reliable responses.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It looks like we lost
Matt.
Tony here. I'll have to check in and see what happened. But at least you got to ask the one question and join us for a bit. And this is a great conversation. I'm hoping we can have you on again sometime as the situation continues to unfold. I think there are a lot more conversations here to have. So
I think so too. I think it'll be interesting to see where we are in like 2 months.
2 months,
I think that we're
a
going
year.
to 2 months.
It's going to be very,
continue
very
to evolve.
interesting. It evolves so fast. There's just news every week. Completely agree. Anyway, looking forward to continuing to read your newsletter. Thank you for putting that out there. And it'll be interesting to watch the big fights over these topics too.
It'll continue. DIKW, just look out for that conversation.
Okay.
The DIKW knowledge pyramid. So,
okay. And where can our listeners and viewers find you? I can put a link in the show notes as well.
You can find me on LinkedIn. I'll have a new website out in about 2 weeks.
Okay.
And then Substack. So
fantastic.
3.
Okay. And I'll get those links from you. They'll be in the show notes if anyone's interested, which you totally should be. So, all right. Thank you so much. And we'll talk again soon.
All right. Thanks, Matt.